Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another session of Toward a Quality of Life. We are coming to you from the Washington Park Mall in Roxbury in the BNN TV studio supported by cable. It is Thursday, September 24th at 7 p.m. Well, by the time I'm speaking with you this evening, I thought the whole quagmire and fiasco and silly, stupid, ignoramus situation in Washington, D.C., in the United States and across the world regarding our president and so on would be through. But I turn on the TV, and anywhere I turn, I'm seeing that it's going strong. And I also see that it very well may be going strong 1 year from now, as I hear people saying. And I want to know, what is the purpose to keeping it going as it has been going? And who's behind this? And how could this be on top of a Congress that has been called by people of all persuasions a Congress that has done the least work and passed the fewest bills ever in the history of Congress? I'm also told that Congress is looking for truth, and I'm very befuddled to figure out what more truth could be found out. As though we don't know that the President and Monica Lewinsky had a sexual liaison together and that they each tried to cover it up or to not let people know about it, at least in the public way that it's come about. I also hear that the head of the Judiciary Committee may very well not want Monica Lewinsky to appear, if you could believe that. Put on your thinking cap and try to imagine that if they are to have hearings, perhaps Monica Lewinsky, the star witness of this whole affair, may not be asked to appear. Perhaps, of course, enough force will be put on to the committee to make her appear, but imagine such an idea when one is trying to take this forward as the Congress is currently doing, to try to not have the star witness appear. No pun intended. And what a situation this so-called hearing, I can't really call it a hearing. We're hearing something, but it's not a hearing. What a situation this so-called hearing is, inasmuch as it's open-ended. Imagine, politically, legally, any way you want, to be accused of wrongdoing and to have a situation put into place where some part of what you're doing wrong is before those who would judge you, and much of what you supposedly might be doing wrong, or certain parts of it, is not before them, and it may be there, it may not be there, it could be brought forward in the future, it may not be brought forward in the future. How is one prosecutor, how is one persecutor, how is one person running an inquisition allowed to say, oh, by the way, here's some evidence for now, so to speak, and in the future I may have more? Imagine any situation or circumstance that you could be accused and brought before a panel under such a condition. So at least we can keep digging, and who has any rights against this? You can go on, and there can be a never end. In other words, when we dig so deep as this, we can dig some more, and if we don't find enough there, or even if we do, we want to get some more, and we're leaving our digging options open in perpetuity. Is that some kind of immorality against individual rights, against human rights, against a situation that could happen to any one of us? The idea being that there but for the grace of God go you or I. So today, I like to paraphrase what I'm talking about as none dare call it treason. And the treason that I'm referring to is the treason of virtually trying to overthrow a duly elected government, a government of a person who is president that certainly did not win a majority, a clear majority of votes, but of all the candidates won the most votes, and by the legal system under which we operate was decidedly the winner of the election. A treason of trying to say there has to be a second referendum at best if we can't outright just get rid of someone we don't want in office, those of us who don't. In fact, perhaps a minority who don't. An outright move to betray, in a sense, what has been called the revolting generation to which the person who is president belongs, and many of the things that he stands for and associates with belongs. Imagine that I get this phrase, revolting generation, from someone on television who cited an article in a so-called conservative magazine, and I'm not against anything conservative. I probably am quite conservative myself, in theory, in the true meaning of the word, but someone citing what is called stereotypically today conservative literature cited an article called The Revolting Generation. Now imagine, this means that those of us in a generation who today I believe would be known as baby boomers, having revolted at one time, namely in the 60s and into the 70s, beginning in the 50s, but also using a double play on words that these same people who did this or were part of this are revolting, are disgusting, are repulsive, the revolting generation, a betrayal to the generation that is part and parcel of the United States of America and is as much the United States of America as the blood running through everyone's veins, is the blood, sweat, and tears, the progeny, the ancestry, the future, and the regeneration of the spirit and human kind that make up this country. It's a very not nice thing to say, and it's a great insult to us who are the very seed and product of this land. And in fact, the person who is president, who is Bill Clinton, is not even one of the more radical or more, even take it outside of politics, one of the more liberal and libertarian and laissez-faire and hippie, whatever kind of nomer you'd like to put on it, free thinker, examining consciousness, expanding his mind kind of person from that generation. He is rather a straight person relative to a bulk of the people who belong to that generation, being referred to as revolting. The person who is president wrote a letter of conscience at the time of the Vietnam War. He also was a Rhodes Scholar at the time of the Vietnam War, and he also landed during that period in Russia, during which time he joined to protest against that war. And so many people during his first election like to point to that and call him a communist sympathizer. Let's look at what others did during the period of that Vietnam War. Did they stand up and write a point-blank letter of conscience? Did they put down on paper the arduous, heartfelt process of trying to figure out what to do about this terrible, extremely uneasy circumstance that was occurring under our flag? Other people fled to Canada. Other people got student deferrals as much as they could. Other people even caused themselves mental and physical illness, very dire physical illness, in order to be regarded as 4F or unfit for military service, unable to serve. These are the extremes people went through to try to avoid the war known as Vietnam. And this is the United States of America, and it is that period of expansion of consciousness, that period of freedom, that period of here are the children you birthed, here are the possibilities of what humans can do. Here are people who are fed well, educated well, taken care of well, brought forward in a country that is very relatively technologically advanced even at that time. Here is what they can do with the fruits of all these things that have created this country that has such a mystique, at least up till now, around the world. Here are the possibilities to the human spirit. One of these possibilities being a right to protest, unlike so many other places, a right to protest something that is thought to be wrong and immoral, and a right to not be blindly obedient to something that is considered to be unswerving authority over the hearts and minds of people. These are the beautiful rights. These are the beautiful possibilities that the generation was experiencing, product of our mothers and fathers who fought in World War II, who fought in World War I, who fought in Korea, products of this blessed land, and in some ways an economic miracle. I call it treason to try to overthrow a duly elected president in this system, all things being equal and all things being relative to each other, and the way the system does work, corrupt though it may be, commercially entrenched though it may be, relative to the field of politics as we know it today. I call it treason because the United States of America, if it is anything, unlike countries in Eastern Europe, unlike countries in Latin America, unlike countries around the world, if it is anything, it is a country where, in practice, all people within are part of the country. All the children, all the progeny are part of the country. And when there were problems in Los Angeles some time ago during the George Bush administration, and problems in Los Angeles many years before then, and problems in Los Angeles in general, that is part of the country. And when there are problems with Native American reservations and territories, that is part of the country. And when there are problems with people who are of homosexual orientation, that is part of the country. It is all part of the country, and this country stands for that all people count. All people have inalienable rights. All people matter, and all people can receive due process. And our country is a country of people searching and rejecting and spreading their wings and opening their minds to find what can they do better, especially as some of the things that are handed down no longer are useful for the times we find ourselves in, no longer are useful for the modern styles of living we must accommodate ourselves to, no longer are useful for the new kinds of dilemmas we have to answer for. I'm talking about a country, of course, which culminated in the saga of Woodstock, 500,000 strong, and everywhere was a sound and celebration of love of life, of liberty, of being human, of being kind, and being in harmony with each other. And the people who are in this generation called revolting lived also in a time of economics where for a relatively new and greater number of people, the possibilities for freedom, the possibilities to search and find, the possibilities to express were more open and available than they were to our fathers and our grandfathers, because we were not so tied to the daily contingencies of making a living, the hardcore contingencies of having our nose pressed to the grindstone. We were also able to explore who we are as human beasts, because we didn't have to just never look into those matters, as we would be too busy just trying to survive economically. Yes, we had economically good times, and we've continued to have some relatively economically good times. But the seed that was starting to push itself out, to start to open into something quite possible and beautiful, continues to be there, rather dormant, perhaps in the winter of its possibility for humanity, for humanism, for humanitarianism, for ecumenism, for brotherly love. Though those words don't cross our tongues very much, nor do those thoughts these times. And it was in the generation of which I speak that college was some new, fascinating, stimulating, and tantalizing possibility. And in those times, we did not necessarily just go and study the hard sciences. We certainly did not go and take up merely technical interests, such as computer programming. No, we took up nothing that had to do with programming. We took up all those liberal arts educations of the thinkers and philosophers from around the world, because we were thinking and philosophizing, and we were pushing ourselves further than we had ever gone before, especially in the sense of more people being able to do this and doing this than ever before. And at the same time, we had the sense that there was something very wrong with materialism. Of course, many of us have gone on to adopt materialism and have it as our standard for how we live. And yet, the beginnings of this movement, of this inner spirit coming forward, if you will, rejected materialism very heavily and said, material things cannot make my life happy. It is not what I am looking for. I am looking for harmony, cooperation, a breaking down of the lines of separation amongst people, and I am looking for a kind of justice, a kind of social justice. And this was said to this was a sense in the most apolitical, and many and most in the generation were apolitical. It wasn't really a generation about the Vietnam War, though that played a very big role. It was a generation separate from that war. It was an apolitical generation. It was a generation that was expanding its consciousness, expanding its mental, psychological, emotional, fraternal possibilities. It's the generation that showed us the life of Mrs. Robinson and the materialism and emptiness and wrong pathways of that kind of life. It was a life where people who had no interest in politics but certainly interest in each other could sit on the stoop in this very city of Boston in the evening. All over the streets, everywhere, people would be out on their stoops, and they might have guitars, and they might be singing, and they might be having fun, banging a drum, and doors weren't locked in apartment buildings, and people could walk into each other's apartments even without knocking. And music, music, music. Everything was music. Yes, we in that time were looking to break down barriers between people. And though there were hard areas that turned quite sour and not so pretty at times, there was a phenomenal pulse of people trying to get together. And basically, not even trying, just being together. And people were renouncing violence. We knew, of course, about Dr. Martin Luther King, who is very noted for a nonviolent approach to civil justice. But even separate from Dr. King, in an apolitical arena, which by far most people were into being groovy. They were into hanging out. They were into just being and not having conflict with each other. Something gripped us emotionally where it was much easier to not be strangers or to not be formal. And we very much knew each other. And we spent very much time in communication or company of each other. Not so that we would have company, we just happened to be together very much of the time. And of course, one didn't have to run to and fro as one does today. One did not have a scheduled life. This is part of the economic underpinning. One had a relative freedom without realizing it to be in convivial camaraderie with people around oneself. And there's a road in the distant light, and the eagle flies with the night. And if you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with. Of course, now we are more like atomic particles. Future Shock portrayed a book written about the future whose author, I can't recall at the moment, portrayed a culture that we are in today, even beyond today, of people just hitting each other in a second, in the night, in time, in space and time, and being off in each in its own direction, each in her own direction. We are now atomic particles, aggregated but not communicated. Our humanity is relatively stripped away. And the other day I happened to be in a college where a concert was going on, and the concert had people that to adults would have seemed like students just screaming at the top of their lungs was the music. And this was because, in my opinion, there's still some humanity left where people are shouting out of their skins, at least while they're young, to be heard, to have an identity, to have a reality, to be for real, and to need to be. But I remember back to the era of the 60s in particularly, and the Beatles song of I am you and you are me and we are all together. And then I remember, even before that, Elvis Presley saying, everybody let's rock. And I remember Chuck Berry saying he was riding along in his automobile, hail, hail, rock and roll. And I remember Elvis Presley saying, you ain't nothing but a hound dog. In other words, we're breaking loose. Turn back the past. We are going into something new. And there were politics too. And some people were interested specifically in politics. In particular, some people paid an extreme amount of attention to politics. And when they did, they started to investigate, especially situations in Latin America. And they found out that unfortunately there was a lot of what was called oppression going on from government to government, where people within borders did not have a voice to speak, sort of like on a monopoly board, and perhaps enforcing their will against the intrinsic better value of people who lived in the country that was under imperial influence. And then there was the war in Vietnam. And it was a terrible war. And it was the era, as has been said, when television technologically was bringing to us images of the horrors of war, which had a great deal to do with our so-called knowledge of what was going on in Southeast Asia and our greater imperative and momentum to cease the carnage. And it was a war unlike anything, so to speak, as are all wars, but in particular this one stood out as a war unlike anything we had ever experienced before because of the terrain, because of the climate, because of the conditions, and because of a new thing called guerrilla warfare, which we came very slow to consciously appreciate. And it was new inasmuch as the terms of the war were vague. The meaning of why we were there was relatively vague. It couldn't quite be satisfactorily recognized. By the way, for those of you who might be interested, I recently completed a short film called Vietnam, which I will be showing soon, so please tune in, and at the end of my shows or elsewhere you may see some notices regarding this piece that I call Vietnam, about the war and everybody during that war of Vietnam. And let us go back and remember, too, that Vietnam was a situation where many people were trying to get out of the war, and many people were going into the war. Divided opinions on this moral dilemma. So during this generation, there was a spirit and the concern for philosophy en masse, relatively, not completely, but to a greater degree than ever before. Concern about philosophy, truth, beauty, knowledge. We were in college. We were going to college. We were studying, and we were studying subjects in the liberal arts. We were getting educated. We weren't getting technologically trained. We were educating ourselves. We were expanding our minds. We were trying to get a taste of wisdom. And we also lived under the aftermath and the karma and the aftershock of knowing and finding out that we could very well be nuclearly annihilated. We were living under that vague existential horror that was a new kind of intrinsic trauma that we had to somehow swallow and digest, if possible, and carry on. We were living in the legacy of the potential for nuclear annihilation. We were living in the legacy of Cold War and Sputnik out of Russia being the first to go into space. And we were trying to use our minds to examine and re-examine. And one of the things we were re-examining, if we were political, is where are governments leading us? This was an intellectual question. We also had the increasing sophistication and burgeoning of the United Nations coming into greater reality. And we were in a time where psychology was coming to a pinnacle, in a sense. People were sitting in groups, exploring their psyches, exploring their hostilities and complexes, their hurts and pains and denials, their fears, their distrusts, their dislikes, their hatreds. One person who comes to mind is psychologist Fritz Perls in California, a great haven for this psychology at its pinnacle, leading groups of Gestalt therapy, where we let our hair down. That's where the expression comes from, that era. Let our hair down, so to speak, and so much hair, I forgot to mention, was so very long. People let their hair grow. They were letting it all hang out. Give me some of that hair. And it was a time when many of the major psychologists were being read and devoured, and people were entering into relationships either in group or individually, exploring what their hang-ups were. We have to tell a joke here. Woody Allen did a lot of exploring, I believe a lot with psychoanalysts, which is a very particular kind of psychology. And I remember one joke he makes about being in group and having two teams, the neurotics versus the psychotics. I think that was said in his monologue as part of a baseball team they had, the neurotics against the psychotics. So people were exploring, and they were challenging who their parents were, in a sense of, how am I my parents' child? And what kind of things are in me that I can ameliorate, that come handed down to me from how I have lived, from how my parents have lived. And people were feeling a lot of malaise. It also comes at a time of a pinnacle of existential psychology, where people were feeling, just in the sense of being alive and breathing, that there's some kind of crisis deep inside. And of course, you put this against all the new kinds of moral dilemmas, the amount of people that were able to think these things, the backdrops of trauma such as nuclear annihilation potential, etc., all coming together in a crise, in a crisis of the soul. And people actually were restituted to a degree by going through these exploratory relationships, individually or in group, and thinking along these lines. And it was not as it is today, where what one lived was conceptualized within such a framework. It was just part, without realizing it, of what somebody would do very naturally, without making a big deal about it. Just do it very naturally, explore, and be done with it, but not make a whole rubric within which they could frame who they were, or frame what the meaning of their life was, or what the meaning was of what they do. It was more a true, natural, flowing exploration, and it was beautiful. Most things about the era of which I speak were very beautiful. Contrary to many of the facetious jibes you will hear from time to time about this period. And it was in this time, too, that people were studying the poets. Poets like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, J. Alfred Prufrock, who talked about feeling like a crab walking the floor of the sea, and who felt at that time so unempowered that he might go out of this world with a whimper, not a bang. And Gerard Manley Hopkins, who on his knees said to God, "Send my roots rain." And a novelist named Kazan, who wrote a book called The Apartment, about New York life and the life of relations of someone who would be living a New York life, who would be living a 60s life, a 50s life, a 70s life. A new phenomenon, as every era has its new contingencies, its new flavors, its new aromas, its new realities, its new ways of relating, its new ways of being. And of course, it had to do with unconventional liaisons between a man and a woman, as were many of the liaisons, relatively speaking, in that period. And they were no longer under the rug. They were coming out in the open. And people were exploring in the physical domains as well. And that period of which I speak is sometimes put down as a period of lewdness, but that is not what it was. It was, for the most part, people truly exploring new kinds of relationships and challenging some of the old traditions, such as marriage, such as sex only within marriage, as so many things were coming together and breaking down and giving witness to egregious problems with the static or status quo situation up to that time. I'm thinking of Joyce Carol Oates, for example, exposing what some life within a family was like up to this time. And many of the great novelists, and all this opening up, flowering into some new kind of possibility that is yet to actualize into the future, that is yet in a state of constant change, arriving who knows where, as the family continues to break down, but now in a more devastating, erratic, unconsidered, and lack of time for people to be with each other way. Because back then, people could have deep commitments and relationships under any kind of circumstances because there was time and people were in constant communion and company with each other. History is always in evolution, as it is right now, in our automatonic robotic lives. There continues to be underlying social justice evolutions, social evolutions. And as we go through these evolutions, we come into new kinds of moorings that have to be adapted, whether we mean to do so or not, according to the circumstances we find ourselves in. And if we are at all daring to be, we try to experience what we can. We try to step out. We try to search and see and know and do something more, do something greater, do something different, do something better. And this is what was happening during the time of which I am speaking. Today, what is happening to a greater degree, perhaps in adaptation, is people pulling inward and people accommodating, but accommodating in ways that cut off much of this expansive potential. Because the stakes are much higher now, much faster now, and you can't lean on anyone. And there are no communications, and there are no camaraderies, and there are no groups, and there are no communions, and there are very few relationships. And there is so little time, there is no time, and there's very little shared experience. So the possibilities become much more fearsome and much more thwarted, much more practical, and much more small as far as humanism, humanitarianism, brotherliness. Expanded consciousness. And there are so few chronicles of the 60s that can convey how it was to live in those times. And it really is something to envy, I must say. It probably even was envious if it were not for the horrible wars, 1 and 2, that we went through in these countries. It was probably really good to live in the 40s as well, where there was optimism beyond that into the 50s, when there was some optimism after the Depression, not counting the war, of course, where there was something to live for, something forward-moving, that really came into an expanded, gorgeous kind of panorama as the 60s approached. It really was a time, a beautiful time, an enviable time. I've never seen any movies to even scratch upon what it might have been like to live in that time. I've never read any books, and I've never heard any conveyances of what it would have been like to live in that time. I've heard some nasty references. I've heard some referrals to drugs, to LSD, to hippies, some negative, and what pretty and unique people most hippies were. And they were in the decided minority of this relative mass consciousness that I'm talking about. So it's very hard to convey. It can't even be articulated from the vantage point of where we are today, psychologically and culturally. Time is what we had. Time has come today. Time. Music, drugs, oh yes, but it wasn't drugs like today. People are saying, oh, what is she saying now? No, it wasn't. There was time. And people were not just crashing, they were taking, in large part, drugs as a way to alter consciousness. Drugs as a way to experience new things. They weren't burnt out on some of what have been called the harder, coarser drugs of today. They weren't destitute and void. They were experimenting with alter ego and alternate realities. And they were having a very mellow, yellow time. It was in great part, quite different use of drugs. And in fact, pharmaceutical companies today continue to work on such mind-altering, expanding drugs, and will slowly be introducing them as time moves on for people to alter their moods, to alter their consciousness, to alter various parts of their real-time experience. And it was a time of profound rock lyrics, as continued into the 70s, as continued into the 80s, and even as continued sometimes today. Profound rock lyrics, where so much of our new philosophy, our new freedom, our new blowing the lid off the old, struggling and working with birthing into something new, to a great degree where you could be anyone and get up and have something to say. You didn't have to be born to a certain station in life. You didn't have to have a certain kind of training. If you had it in you and you felt it in you, you could just get up and generate it and project it and put it across, as did so many of what we call legends in rock. And this was precursed by bop of the 50s and the era of Greenwich Village in New York. And the jazz artists like Yusef Lateef and Stan Getz and Thelonious Monk, breaking it down for you, going into a new kind of consciousness, out with the rigid old. And beyond the 60s, into the jazz lyrics of the 70s, where Idris Muhammad talked about, turn this mother out, turn this mother out. And where a person whose last name was Webster, first name was Webster, as I recall, Webster Lewis, I believe, talked about love is the way. And where Bob Dylan during the 60s told us, I don't want to work on Maggie's farm no more. and told us so many other things, and Simon and Garfunkel. Captured the mood and gave us a picture of the depths of our consciousness. So society was starting to break down in a nice sense, not in a disorganized sense, in a beautiful sense. Barriers breaking, cultures mixing, subcultures mixing, different so-called groups that today we tend to, in a way, categorize again and specify again along lines of gender and race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. These things were breaking down. They were breaking down, and people were saying they shouldn't matter, more by their actions than by their words. And society was loosening up, and the clothing changed radically. Get rid of those heavy tie shoes. Get rid of those starched suits. Get rid of that short hair. Just let the hair grow. Wear easy flowing clothes. And just to be frivolous and beautiful and poetic, throw a few beads on it. And then add some day glow. Add some neon. And take a pen, take a brush in your hand and paint. Paint. And experience. And alter it further with drugs. Take a drug. Experience. Push your consciousness. Now, I know this is not always, and this is not always the means and ways in which substances are used. But this is how it was in the 60s, and let's tell it like it is, generally speaking. And so we evolved into what we are today, which is what I started out with when I first began to speak with you this evening. We evolve into this generation that we are today, the children of the United States of America, the valid citizens of the United States of America, who take the history, the freedoms, the philosophy, the birthright, the Constitution, the thinking. We take it very seriously. The potential. We take it for real. We're indoctrinated into it. We feel we can live it. We are for real. We are the product of this country. We are this country. And anybody who is in this country is a member of this country, for better or for worse. And there are not some who are better than others. There are not some who have the right values and some who do not. There are not some who belong to the right group and some who do not. There are not some who have the proper religion or have religion at all and some who do not. No, there is one freedom. There is one United States of America. And everyone who is a citizen of this country or a member of this country is part of that country, is the fabric of this country, is the meaning of this country. And if there's anything this country truly stands for, by history and by fact, it is to live and let live. So I will stop here for this evening, and I will part saying that what is going on in Washington and in the United States and over so many cable television networks, in violation of basic human rights and basic human decency, is hurting us as humans. It's hurting us bad. We can even feel the pain. Yes, there are many of us who are hurt by this, literally, and if we don't know it, we're hurt by it figuratively. And when you see people reacting to it when they're in large numbers, those who are not condemning and calling for a lynching or being spiteful, those who are not doing that are at best just so embarrassed they don't know what to do. They haven't even got a voice to do it because they don't know what to do. It is just so embarrassing. And in spite of the automatonic and materialistic culture that we now operate in, there is a new age. We've been in a new age. It will not go away. It is just that seed, slightly open, perhaps dormant in winter. It is just that seed. There is a new age. And it will keep going, and it will keep growing. Because even while so many hard and immoral contingencies bear down on our right to pursue life, liberty, happiness, sex, and to not tell people about it, we also have new kinds of makings of ways we can be that suit us personally, that continue to coexist even under these contingencies. They continue to coexist, ways of being who we really are. And perhaps we're just dormant and sleeping at the present time. In parting to you, I will quote yet one more song out of the generation of the 60s, the revolting generation. And whoever would call us revolting is mean and crude and dastardly. Out of the revolting generation. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. The age of Aquarius. Harmony and understanding, sympathy and love abound. Aquarius. Good night.
Somewhere there's a place where women wear the face, get to ride horses and be beautiful and upheld. Somewhere there's a place, I don't know when it was, I don't know if it came already or if it'll come sometime in the future.